Thanks for joining this afternoon, this Friday afternoon. I know Jana. I'm not sure I know the other attendees. I've shrank my little video picture, so I can't tell if people are sort of trickling in, but I'm Ella August. I'm a faculty member at the School of Public Health. And I also run a writing support organization called PREPS. Molly is going to be hosting the chat and the webinar today. If you have questions that pop up, midstream, please feel free to type them into the chat. And Molly, you could just jump in, at an opportune time. And I will also circulate a PDF of the slides after the webinar is over. So one final thing, Molly and I were just sharing with each other how we both like to watch the captions when we're watching TV or watching movies. If you want to look at the captions on the screen as I talk, you can click the CC. I think it's called like Enable Closed Caption or CC button on the bottom of your Zoom menu. I think, or maybe show subtitle or something like that. And you should be able to see translation of what I'm saying as I speak onto the page. And you all should be muted when you join. Please keep your microphone on mute during the presentation. And that way we can minimize any background noise. Okay. So this is an overview of the webinar. I'm going to cover selecting a suitable target journal, developing clear and testable research objectives, setting up your paper with a solid introduction, writing a comprehensive methods section. I'll give a few results tips, interpreting and contextualizing with your discussion section, writing a title that feels like an invitation to your readers. And then I'll include a few advanced writing tips where I hope to. And then I'll give a summary. And then hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end. So that's sort of an ambitious agenda. That said, this will not be a totally comprehensive training. I give 2 or 3 day trainings on this topic in my work at PREP. So this is really hopefully hitting on some of the key points that will be helpful to you and moving forward with your manuscripts. Okay, so the learning objectives for today's webinar are to understand the basic structure of a research paper and be able to apply key approaches for writing a publishable paper. I'm going to do my best to cover the basics, and as I had mentioned, as we were chatting a bit before the webinar started, I do have a few more advanced tips on writing. So hopefully, I'm hoping there'll be something for everyone in this webinar, and even the more experienced among you can benefit from the time you're spending with me today. So the first thing I want to talk about is choosing a target journal, the journal where you hope to publish your paper. A target journal is important, or knowing what your target journal is important because it determines who your readers will be. And every journal has a core sort of readership. So when you're choosing your journal, you're also choosing your audience. And when I say audience, I mean readers. So the reason I'm talking about this first in this webinar is because arguably, the most important metric of successful writing is how well you reach your target audience. And you really need to know who your readers will be so you can tailor your paper to them. All right, so hallmark, I think most of you, or maybe many of you, have been to my trainings before. Sort of the hallmark of my trainings are including a lot of examples. So we'll be looking at a lot of examples throughout, trying to make these points as concrete as possible. So I just mentioned tailoring your writing to your readers. So let's think about how can we do this. I'm going to give some examples. So this is an example from the Journal of Health Economics. It's about a paper describing research looking at e-cigarettes use and birth outcomes. And this is obviously a big block of text, and you shouldn't try to read it all right now. Just showing this example to make the point that how you write the introduction and the rest of the paper, for that matter, really depends on what journal you're writing for. So I just added a green box around the second paragraph. And this paragraph spends a bit of time explaining what e-cigarettes are and why they're harmful. So this is totally appropriate here because the readers of the Journal of Health Economics are probably not going to know much about e-cigarettes. They probably know a lot about economic theories and economic policy, but not necessarily anything about tobacco. So choosing a journal early on will help you understand who your readers are. Then and only then can you really begin to tailor your paper to your audience. So just imagine for a moment if this were a tobacco journal. If it were a tobacco journal, if it were an article written for a tobacco journal on this very same topic, probably the authors would have included less explanation or even no explanation about what e-cigarettes are, because the readership will already be very familiar with this product. All right, here's another example of tailoring. I'm going to just move this little menu thing out of the way here. It's distracting me. Okay, so this is another example of tailoring. And this is the same paper we just looked at. This is a blurb from the discussion, and it's about future directions that can extend the research presented in this paper. So I've just underlined one of the sentences in green. And I know it can be hard to look at these examples out of context, but let's see if we can make sense of this one. It says, future work is needed to evaluate the effect of ENDS indoor vaping restrictions on other populations besides pregnant women. So the authors are extending, they're suggesting that future studies evaluate, their intervention on other non-pregnant populations. And this is totally appropriate given that this is written for the Journal of Health Economics. But you can imagine that if this were a different type of journal, the applications would be very different. For example, if this were a pregnancy journal, then the recommendations for future work would not be to evaluate other populations besides pregnant women, right? They would probably want to go deeper and understand more about the effect in pregnant women. If this were a clinical journal, then the future directions might focus on patient care. So these are two examples of tailoring from the introduction and the discussion, and they're not the only ways in which you need to tailor your paper to the core readership, but hopefully you have a better sense of what I'm talking about when I say tailor your paper to the audience. So one question you might have is, well, how do I know who the core readership is of a given journal? For example, who are the readers of the Journal of Health Economics? So ideally, you'll be able to get this information from the journal's website. Often there's a blurb on who the readers are, the core readership, in the About This Journal or the Aims and Scope section of the website. But it's also true that not all journals do this, and you may need to sort of infer the information from about who the readership is based on the topics that the journal covers. So in this particular case, the journal does not give you an explicit description of their core readership, but you can figure it out from their aims and scope. And I apologize again, there's a lot of text here, and no need to read it right now. But this is the text from the journal's scope page. The point here is that you can infer from this description here that the readers of this journal are going to be economists, academics working in economics, and policymakers. And a key takeaway is that no area of health in particular is the focus of this journal. So while you can assume that, again, readers are going to understand the economic theories and methods and frameworks, you can't assume they will have background knowledge about any particular health condition that you're writing about. So a question I get a lot when I give this talk is, I read a lot of different journals, and I know that I am not part of the so-called core readership of every single one of these journals that I read. Why should I focus on a journal's core readership when we're all reading, sort of very widely? So it's true, all readers are not part of a journal's core readership, but as writers and as oral presenters, anytime we communicate with an audience, we're likely writing or speaking to those with diverse backgrounds, knowledge, and experience. So the best approach, really the only way forward, is to focus on that core readership of your target journal, because that's going to be the primary audience. Those are the people, that are going every week and reading they're keeping up in this, particular journal. And I should mention also at this point that I'm going to complicate this whole idea of writing to a journal's core readership just a bit later in my presentation. So just keep this idea on ice for now. All right. So now I'm going to talk about strategies for choosing a target journal, but I want to hear from you first. What strategies do you currently use to choose a target journal? If you could type your strategies that you use into the chat, and maybe Molly, if you'd be willing to read those out as people type them.
Mm-hmm. So we have look at my reference list from the intro and discussion section.
Good. It's a good one. Any others?
Mix of impact factor, audience as stated by journal.
Okay. Any others?
Jane.
Jane. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Those are all good strategies. And they also appear, some of those strategies. First one, Jane. First of all, let me just say, I suggest using multiple strategies to identify sort of a short list. And then from there, think about some career objectives and, maybe discuss with your mentor. But Jane is definitely one of them. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Jane, it stands for Journal Author Name Estimator. And it's a computer algorithm where you can paste in your abstract and your title, and it will return for you some suggested journals that might be good matches. I have the address at the end of the presentation in the resources slides. You can just Google Journal Author Name Estimator, and it's a free program. Second, you can enter the keywords for your paper into a database like PubMed or Scopus and see what journals come up. They may be a good fit for your paper. Third, look in your reference list, and somebody mentioned that. Chances are some of the journals you have cited, especially in the intro and the discussion, as was mentioned, chances are some of those journals might be a good fit for your paper. And then finally, I want to emphasize, if you're a junior researcher, you should seek advice from your senior author on the paper / mentor to see what journal they think is a good fit. And I know that all of you have good mentors on your research projects, and this is a good conversation to have. Usually how I stage it, and I'm not going to go into detail in this webinar, but I do, have participants, workshop attendees go through using these 4 strategies first to develop a short list, and then to go a bit deeper, think about your goals of where you want to establish your reputation, impact factor, some other, considerations. Actually, some of those might be on the next slide. Yes, some of them are. Okay. So to narrow down, these are touching on some of these key factors. Is I guess the first thing is what what group of people can make the best use of information in your paper? For example, if your paper has applications for clinicians, then, clinical journal makes sense. But if your paper includes information you hope to see translated into policy, then, you might consider going with a policy journal or a journal that also includes a policy focus. Another thing to think about, as you have, your sort of your short list of potential journals, is that every study has strengths and weaknesses. You should consider these when you're choosing your target journal. For example, let's say you did a study on dual use in pregnant women and pregnancy, and your measure of dual use frequency was a bit flawed, but you still think it's worthy of publication. Then you may want to avoid a tobacco journal. Reviewers, and readers for that matter, of a tobacco journal are going to scrutinize the way you measured the tobacco variables in your study. That's probably one of the first things they'll look at when they open the paper. So in this scenario, if you have like a flawed tobacco measure, it's probably better to go with a non-tobacco focused journal, like a pregnancy journal in this case, or a general journal like PLOS One could be an option. On the flip side, know what your study's strengths are and align your journal choice with them. So impact factor, somebody mentioned that earlier. It's an important, impact factor reflects how often articles in a given journal were cited in the past, say, 2 years or 5 years. So it's important. There's a lot to say about this metric. It has flaws, but it's still an important consideration when you're choosing a target journal. And finally, you may decide that publishing your article in an open access journal or one that provides open access with a fee is important. So, that's something you'd want to get more information on in the journal's website.
And Ella, I will jump in and say somebody shared that, yes, they agree they get really good advice from experienced research and co-authors, and mentioned a few of their mentors.
Okay, great. So just like a general comment?
Yeah, just general comment.
Yeah, thanks. That's great. That's great to hear. I'm familiar with some of the mentors in the Castor project, and it seems like there's a very close connection between the trainees and the mentors, and maybe some of you have multiple mentors. I hope that is the case. That can be really helpful to early career researchers, just to get a variety of different perspectives. So thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to mention here that there's a lot of journals out there that use predatory practices and that you should take care to avoid them. I'm sure you are all familiar and that you all know what predatory practices are, but for the sake of completeness, I'll mention that the so-called predatory journals are dishonest journals or publishers who publish papers with essentially little or no peer review. And let me add that people like librarians or informationists who know a lot about this topic, a lot more than me, no longer refer to predatory journals per se. They find it helpful instead to refer specifically to predatory practices to help us be mindful and identify specifically where the problems are with these journals, what practices are problematic. So, for example, while some journals like this one showing on your screen here, the International Journal of Innovative Research and Advanced Studies, they may publish real papers. None offer rigorous peer review. Basically, they want your money. And you may have received, I know this is a little bit hard maybe to see on your screen. This is a screenshot of an email I recently got from a looks like a potentially sketchy journal. And oftentimes, I, and you probably have too, received an email invite from one of these journals. This one offers publication within 12 days. And this is pretty typical of these types of solicitations. And it can look tempting when you get this type of email, but publishing in a journal like this can really hurt your career. And then once you publish, there's no way to unpublish your paper. People still regularly ask about Beall's list. Beall was a librarian. Jeff Beall was a librarian, or maybe still is a librarian. Actually, I think he's retired now. He lived in Colorado, and he kept this list of predatory journals, and people really liked the list because it was, easy to use, and they could just sort of log on and look up a journal that they're wondering about, because it's not always obvious whether a journal, uses predatory practices. This Beall's list is no longer recommended. He stopped keeping it up in 2016, I think it was. And you can even see there's a little button there, go to update, and there is an updated list. But the reality is that it's impossible to keep up a meaningful list, considering that all the new journals that launch every day and just the constantly changing publication landscape. The best way is for you really to use your critical thinking skills. I do have some resources that can help you just to assess yourself whether the journal looks, like one you would feel comfortable publishing in, or whether there's some red flags coming up. So some good resources. One of them is a website called Think, Check, Submit. It is a list. What you'll get on this website is essentially a list of resources. So, all the resources are helpful. It's not like, it's a big website. I guess I'll just leave it at that. It's a big website. This article is really good. It's about avoiding predatory publishers in the post-Beall world. There's a U of M library guide. That's a really nice guide on the topic. And we just put together some nice resources on my organization's website, Preps. I have links to all these at the end. You can check them out if you're interested. So you all know this already as well, but I have a reminder here that you should only submit your paper to one journal at a time. Some journals are very slow to respond to submissions, but in an extreme scenario, if you don't want to wait any longer, you should really withdraw your paper first before submitting it to another journal. Okay, so the backbone of any paper is the research questions that you ask, your research objectives. And so it's worth spending some time on these to make sure they really come across to your readers. And typically these appear at the end of your introduction section. So research objectives can be written in a variety of different ways. Some are written as questions, some are hypotheses, some are aims, study goals. But regardless of how they're structured, research objectives should address a gap in the literature, which you have already pointed out in your introduction, and I'll get to that in a bit. They should provide the reader a standalone summary of what you evaluated in the summary, in the study, and they should be concrete and narrow enough to address in the context of your manuscript. So research objectives should be clear. You should understand what the study goals are from reading them. They should be specific in that they should describe what you evaluated in the study. Some studies will include one objective and some will include more than one objective. And they should be complete. They, every study is different, but relevant information might include the population, the sample, the independent and dependent variables, study design, timing, the setting, in other words, the geographic location, or is it a hospital, is it a school? And then sometimes the data set, like maybe you're using path data or something like that. So there's a lot of different information that could be appropriate to include, again, depending on, your study design and the type of study it is. Crafting your research objectives takes a lot of time and work. I suggest writing out your objectives and showing them to multiple colleagues and even your mentor to get their take on whether they feel clear and testable. As I mentioned in the last slide, they should also stand on their own with the expectation that people don't read papers in order. They often will flip right to the research objectives, without reading the background. So they should make sense to someone who hasn't actually read the introduction. Let's look at an example. To address this gap in the literature, the purpose of this study was to evaluate the content of a proactive population health management intervention delivered in the context of an FQHC aimed at promoting uptake of a smoking cessation treatment offered by the ITQL among LGBT identified smokers. So one thing that probably kind of jumps out at you when you're reading this is the abbreviations. I strongly suggest limiting or even eliminating abbreviations in your paper, actually, in general, unless they are very well known, like DNA. And there are many reasons for this, but maybe the most important reason, again, is that readers don't tend to read papers in order from beginning to end. They don't read a scientific manuscript like they do a novel or a news article. Someone might, pick up a paper, they start by looking at the abstract, they look at the research question, they go straight to the discussion, and they're likely to miss where you defined the abbreviations. And then they have to search through the paper and find where you set up your abbreviation, which is sort of annoying. I think that using abbreviations definitely makes it easier for the writer and saves words, but they don't always make it easier for the reader, and that should really be your goal. This is not for the sort of the needs work type of examples I show in my talks. What I typically do is I take an example from another topic area, and then I change some of the words. So this was originally from a different topic, not tobacco, but this was a real sort of research question with those abbreviations. And I often see these in the literature. And, I think that the more you can avoid abbreviations, especially in the title, especially in the abstract, and especially in the research objectives, the easier it's going to be for your readers. Okay, just some specific pitfalls that I would suggest avoiding in your research objectives. Avoid to determine as a way in to your research objectives. It really overpromises what you can accomplish with your paper. For example, it's not possible to determine an association between, psychological stress and heart disease, or, smoking and heart disease with one study. Instead, I would suggest using words like evaluate, describe, or estimate. These don't overpromise, and they're appropriately specific, to what you're doing. I suggest avoiding the objective to study because it is actually not specific enough. Choose more specific verbs like evaluate, describe, or estimate. These are going to be a little clearer to your audience in terms of what is meant, what you're trying to achieve in your study. So I see this a fair amount in published papers, wordy language like the current study aimed to evaluate. This text can feel watered down, and the long windup can cause the research objectives to sort of lose energy. Instead, I suggest streamlining to something simple and sort of punchy, like we evaluated. So the next thing I want to focus on is being specific. Clear research objectives are very specific, and I want to look at a good example. In this study, we examined whether COVID-19 related school closures were associated with smoking initiation among high school students in the American Midwest. And this research objective is clear, and it's actually so specific that just from reading it, you can imagine how they probably set up their analysis. So let's try to imagine the regression model these authors may have used to test this researching. So in this case, it's obvious what their dependent variable is, smoking initiation. And their main independent variable is COVID-19 school closures. So while you don't have a detailed picture of their entire analytic approach, the research objective is clear and complete enough for you to imagine what their main model probably looks like. And I appreciate that this exercise, doesn't work for every type of paper. I know it doesn't apply to many of the papers that you all are writing with your large data sets and your complex statistical approaches, but I'm showing it as one example of a really clear, specific research objective. If you're writing a paper similar to this one, you might try this approach. Is your objective clear and specific enough that someone else could read it and sketch out a rough model? Okay, let's change gears and talk about setting up your paper with a solid introduction. Here, you want to, share with your readers your thought process of developing your study question. I mentioned the importance of providing background earlier that's relevant to your readers, but the introduction is more than just background. You want to share why you did what you did. It's a way of framing your study. I'm going to show a typical structure for an introduction. Not every paper will follow this format, but it can be a good starting place when you're writing your introduction. And you may have seen a graphic like this elsewhere. There are 5 main elements that you can include. The first one is why your research is important. So this is the argument you need to make. This is sometimes called the so what part. Then briefly describe what's already known about your topic. So this shouldn't be long, but it should be specific with citations. Third, describe the research gap. Maybe a previous study didn't go far enough or it was flawed. It's important not to criticize other people's work here, just to explain what was done and that your study builds on the work of others who came before you. Then explain why it's important to fill the research gap. And finally, end with your research objectives. And as I mentioned earlier, you're going to need to add context along the way, defining terms or giving background that your target journals readers might not know. And finally, before moving on from this slide, I want you to notice the shape of this figure. The introduction starts out very broadly and ends narrowly with your research objectives. Okay, I'm going to touch on just 2 common introduction pitfalls here. Maybe the most common pitfall I see is a really long, dense introduction that's unfocused. To avoid this pitfall, follow the upside down triangle that we just looked at and keep your introduction fairly short. You can look at examples from your target journal to see how long their introductions are, to get a sense of how long yours should be, but it's often between 3 and 6 paragraphs long. Another common pitfall is inadequate citations. Any statement that could be challenged should be cited. Let's look at an example here. This one says smokeless tobacco has been proposed as a safer alternative to cigarettes. However, these products are addictive and increase the risk of some cancers and cardiovascular diseases. Moreover, it has been suggested that these products may act as a gateway to cigarette smoking and discourage cessation. So there are multiple claims in this passage, and the first point is that all the citations are not bunched up at the end. It's really clear which citation supports which claim because they're all placed, in some cases mid-sentence, right after the claim. And this is a really good practice. You can also see from this text here, I characterized each study type that was cited in the example. So you could see this numbers 3, 4, 5, and 6, they correspond to the quote up above it. So you can see, number 3 was a national study, number 4 was a systematic review, 5 was a policy statement, et cetera. And so the point I want to make here is that you should consider what the most ideal type of study is for each claim. So, often, as in this example, a systematic review, a randomized trial, or a longitudinal study may be a good option because these types of studies are more rigorous and give more support to a causal association than, say, a cross-sectional study or descriptive study, et cetera. So I suggest that once you have a complete draft of your paper, go back and review it from beginning to end, specifically to check for citations, to make sure that you haven't missed anything. Kind of try to just go through with fresh eyes, just looking at your citations. So often when I'm reading a paper, I see a statement that justifies why they conducted the research study as some version of, because nobody has done this before. And I want to be clear that this is not a good reason to conduct a research study, and it doesn't convey why it's important or helpful to conduct a study. I've got an example here of a good justification for a research study. And this paper, like several of the good examples in this presentation, is authored by a sort of a familiar cast of characters. And so the quote says, "In contrast with previous work, we used a novel individual level approach to evaluate the effects of tobacco policies through microsimulation. The advantage of this method is that it integrates detailed historical information about smoking patterns by birth cohort, age, and gender. The model can be used to evaluate the effects of tobacco control policies within states and within the nation." And so this is a good example that shows why the research they conducted was needed, how it extended beyond what had been done before, and why it will be useful. So it really clearly shows that there's a need that will be filled with their research, and this is really a great example. All right, so let's move on to the methods section. I don't know if these are questions I just see out of the corner of my eye in the chat. Maybe they're from before when we were making a list, but feel free to jump in if questions do arise as I'm speaking. So the methods section should include a description and a justification of what you did. Your methods provides a context for your readers to understand and interpret your results. They provide a chance for you to build the credibility of your study, and they allow other researchers to replicate your study. So in the methods, you should consistently be doing two things. You should explain how the study was done, and this will enable replication by others, and justify why you used the methods that you did. So providing a rationale justifying why you set up the study the way you did will add credibility to the study and also to your author team. So in this slide, I'm going to show a list of elements you can consider describing in your methods section. It's based on a set of guidelines for reporting on observational studies called STROBE. And my sense is, well, first of all, I'm guessing you've heard of STROBE, but I'm guessing that it seems like most of the studies I've seen that your group produces are observational. So that's why I'm using this as an example. STROBE, of course, stands for Strengthening the Reporting of Observational Studies. And the guidelines are part of the Equator Network. That link is at the bottom of the screen. Okay, so the core methods elements for observational studies include the study setting and population, study design and timing, recruitment, your sample and sample size, your data, laboratory analysis, your analytic approach, for example, your statistical analysis, and your ethical approval. So, you know, if your study is not observational, you know, an observational design, you can still go to the Equator Network and find guidelines for most study types on that website. Also note that your target journal may have specifications about the headings they want you to use or how they want the methods to be organized. So make sure to check the author guidelines as you're crafting your methods. Not all of them do, but some do. So it's best to check. All right, so when you're deciding how to organize your methods, I suggest, again, I just said this, consult the author guidelines, but it can also be really helpful. Usually I pull up both. I pull up the author guidelines after I've chosen my journal, and then I pull an example article from a recent a paper from that journal, because sometimes the guidelines change on a similar topic and a similar study design, and that can be really helpful for me to think through like what I want to include in my methods and how I want to organize it. You can also look at the ICMJE, International Committee of Medical Journal Editors guidelines. They've got some good recommendations on how to organize your methods and what to include, structured a little bit differently than the Equator Network. So these resources are helpful in knowing what information to include and how to organize your methods. So I think I only have time for one methods pitfall here. Probably the most common pitfall I see in the methods is the authors didn't explain why they made the decisions they did about the data collection, data analysis, et cetera. And I would say definitely over half of the papers I read don't, in my opinion, include enough justification. So that's something that can really strengthen your paper, is to really focus on this. So let's look at this good example I've picked out to make this point. Because smoking cessation is often not successful and shows a high rate of relapse in the first 2 years, and since the SHG does not model relapse, we defined an individual as a former smoker if they had quit at least 2 years before the interview. Otherwise, their observation was censored at the given age of quitting. So the researchers explain why they classified the variable with this definition. And the word to notice here, oops, that line I think migrated a little bit. It was supposed to be at the top under the word because. So the word I'm trying to get you to notice here is the first word in this quote, because. And I always say that because is the magic word for the methods section, that if you use this word, it means you're explaining why you made key decisions. The word because helps you justify each approach and variable. So one additional point here is that the authors added citations here. You can see 23 to 26 there at the bottom of the second line, or at the end of the second line, to further justify their decision. And this is a very helpful piece of evidence to justify and support the definition that they came up with for this variable. So this was really just a great example. All right, now let's transition to the results section. And I'm not going to focus so much on visuals. I kind of developed a separate webinar on that. Normally, I include that in this type of webinar, but I think the visuals that you all are working with are more complex and kind of deserve their own time and space. So I just have a few light tips for the results section. The first one is to organize your results logically with subheadings. So there isn't one right way to organize your results. You should start by describing your sample, but after that, just decide what makes sense, based on your paper. You might start with the most exciting finding first, or you can present your results in the same order as you introduced your objectives in your introduction section. Regardless, use descriptive subheadings to help your reader navigate your results. So I strongly suggest avoiding generic headings like logistic regression results or density models. These point your reader's attention to the tools or methods used rather than the relationship between variables. And what you really want to focus on in your text and in your results is the relationships between the variables rather than the tools used, unless of course it's a methods paper, and then yes, you will focus on the methods. Okay, I'm just going to focus on one results pitfall. And this is, again, something I see a lot. I'm not sure this is the 100% best example. I was trying to find it. I spend a lot of time trying to find good examples for these. I think this is an okay example. The point here is that even if it seems obvious, you should include the direction of each association. So here's the quote. Compared with the status quo scenario, the projected net public gain, health gain, with the optimistic scenario is 160,000 or 43% fewer premature deaths and 2.2 million or 52% fewer life years lost. So what I want you to notice here is the authors clearly spelled out that the optimistic scenario is associated with fewer premature deaths and life years lost. So constantly, I see in papers that the direction of, people describing their results, but they're not giving you the direction of the association. So here's an example that I made up that's maybe more along the lines of what I more commonly see. Dual use was associated with age and income. So, as a reader, you can maybe guess which direction these associations are. So dual use might be associated, for example, with, younger age and lower income, but it needs to be clearly stated. So the point here is that even if you think it's obvious, include the direction of the association in your results. All right, so I guess this is a second, another tip here. For some reason, I thought I only had like one. So a very common pitfall is to include tables and figures with incomplete titles. So this table is titled Participant Characteristics, and it's not really enough. The title should include more details about the data. Let's look at a different example, a better example. This title says, Socio-demographic characteristics of patients with lung cancer across cancer registries in the United States, 2010 to 2020. And this example is better because it has more information. It more fully describes the data in the table. So to be sure that your table, figures, and titles are table and figure titles are complete, include who, that's the participants, or the animals, if anyone's doing an animal study, what, that's the information shown in the table, when, that's the dates when the data were collected, where, that's where the data were collected, and how, in other words, that refers to the analytic approach you use to generate the results in the table.
Ella, this is
Yes.
Jana.
Hello.
Yeah. So I do try to follow this rule, but some journals have table title limits. So if we have to trim, like I think they're more clinical journals that do this.
That's funny. I've never come across that. Interesting.
Just recently, and we've been trying to go to more clinical journals, so I feel like it must be them. But what I've cut usually is like, so this is for our COVID work, and at the end of each table, I would say like the Michigan COVID-19 Recovery Surveillance Study. So I've tended to drop that, but I don't know if that's the best thing to drop. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know without seeing your data, but what I would maybe think about is if you can sneak in footnotes.
Yeah.
Or even in the head, like so on this one, you can't see me pointing to my computer, obviously. But where it says like total men, women, like maybe even some of those headers, if there's a way you can work in some of the information. But yeah, I think that, or if you could make, you said there's a long study title you use. If you can make that an abbreviation and footnote it at the bottom.
We'll still try to address all of these in the title. Yeah, I think this is a clinical journal thing.
Interesting. I mean, that's just so like, I just feel like sometimes journals shoot themselves in the foot. I think I understand why, especially if they're printing it to save cost.
That's helpful though. I didn't think about that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Try to do it the back door way.
Hi, sorry I'm late. I just actually had a quick question about the previous slide about the directionality piece. So in the past, like I'll give just a very specific example. I've worked on electronic health record data studies where we've looked at, weight change over time, so weight trajectory studies. Yeah. And in the past, I've written, if it's a positive association, I've said, I've referred to weight gain, and I've gotten pushback from other analysts who say, unless you're doing a two-sided, or a one-sided test, you really should say, weight change and not weight direction. So I've been sandwiched in the middle of arguments on either side, and I just didn't know if you had any thoughts on that. Like, should you just? I mean, clearly, if it's positive risk ratio or negative risk ratio, right? Like we don't with risk ratios, we usually say positive or negative, but when it comes to sort of those types of analyses, should you still say the direction? Because clearly it's weight gain, right? If it's positive versus negative.
Yes. I guess I can understand, that perspective. Thanks for sharing that. It's interesting. I always love to hear these, examples and things that people are coming across in their day-to-day work. I think, my perspective is that I think it's clearer and more concrete to say weight gain, and it's a reflection of what is happening in your data. I think it's easier for people to understand, and I will later in the talk a bit more about using concrete language as opposed to more abstract language. There's actually research on actually people within the same discipline, people reading about their own, research in their own discipline, find it easier to understand more concrete, explicit language, even if they know all the jargon, et cetera. But also, as I'll get to later on in the talk, as much as possible, I suggest trying to simplify your language. I think in your example, saying weight gain is just so much easier to understand for people within the discipline, people outside the discipline, and even someone, I think more and more we need to think about people like policymakers or journalists reading our papers. And so to say something a little bit abstract, like an inverse association or even a positive association, if there's a way to simplify that, my advice would be to do that, to make it as simple and concrete as possible. Um, you know, the analysts have their own perspective. So I guess one question is to think about that a little bit more is what type of journal are you writing for? So if it's a methods paper for a methods, oriented audience, then maybe it is better to go with something that would be considered more rigorous and more precise. So that seems like it's a trade-off, right? Rigor and precision versus maybe being more broadly accessible to a greater number of readers, or even more accessible to, even like the target core readership, who might not, be familiar with those, those more jargony, kind of less concrete language choices. Does that answer your question at all or help?
No, it definitely does. Yeah. It's so interesting. I think Jen and I were talking about this the other day, that, it's like every mix of co-authors you publish with, you learn something new from, but then also then you get down into the weeds of like, preference of the, the individual writers on the paper. So I think I agree with you. I think, as much as we can kind of communicate clearly our findings, I think that makes the most sense. So thank you for that.
Yeah. I do think, and I tell people this with peer review too. I am terribly sorry. I need to give my dog a treat because he just came in from his walk. I will be back in 30 seconds. I think it will be better for everyone here. I'll be right back.
I just started to notice that the Zoom emojis are now animated. I think that's kind of fun.
Yeah, I was just noticing that too. I think it's new.
So sorry about that. Okay. But what I was going to say was, a lot of times, with peer reviewing, with journal peer review, for example, you might get conflicting advice. And I think this is really along those same lines, of different perspectives of people, and different, people might make different language choices or different choices about a lot of different things. But I think it can be confusing and possibly frustrating to try to come to a decision or make your way forward when people have such, different and possibly opposing pieces of advice. But I think it can also be helpful to understand how different types of readers are responding to your work, and then to try to really connect how someone responds and what their background is. So maybe, a statistician or more of an analyst might respond one way, but a clinician might respond another way. And then just to try to think through, who is it that I'm most trying to reach with my work? And that can be a way forward, and thinking about, reaching your core, readers or your core audience. But those are great. Thank you so much for those questions and comments. Okay, so now we're going to move to the discussion. The discussion is just the opposite of the introduction. The introduction starts out broad and ends narrowly, but the discussion starts out narrowly and ends broadly. So, as you know, the discussion section is probably the hardest to write. It requires a lot of thought, as you process your findings and decide how to frame them. That said, the discussion is still fairly formulaic in terms of which elements should be included. So I'm going to show a list of key elements, more or less in the order you tend to see them. So typically, you start by summarizing the main findings. Then you want to discuss the significance of the findings and interpret them. You'll need to identify how your results fit with other studies. And this is where you start to expand outside your study results, moving toward a more general scope. And again, when you are discussing other studies, it's important not to criticize. I'm sure everyone is aware of that in this audience. to avoid criticizing other people's work, just to explain that where the sort of the stopping points are of other people's work and how your study fits or extends others' work. So if it's appropriate and there's enough space, depending on the study, you may include a biological or social or other mechanism that might explain the associations you found. Include the strengths and limitations and practical applications in the impact of your work, suggestions for future work, which you can think of as being very general and broad. And I don't have time to go through every element here, but I'm going to provide a few key tips in the areas where I know writers tend to struggle, and then hopefully I'll help you to avoid some pitfalls. All right, so when you're comparing your results to other studies, if your results don't agree, be sure to discuss why. This can be speculation, your own ideas, and educated guesses, but what you say should be, sort of scientifically reasonable and supported with citations where possible. Don't forget to include your strengths. I think it's easy for us as researchers and as human beings to overly focus on the shortcomings of our research, but it's important to remind your readers of, why your study is high quality investigation and what sets it apart from other studies. I suggest starting with your most impressive strength and maybe include 3 to 4 strengths total if you can muster them up. I have a good example here. Here's the quote. A strength of our study is having access to detailed tobacco use data from nationally representative surveys, which allows for quantitative join point analysis of SLT use trends for the past 2 decades in relevant demographic groups. Okay, this is a good way to set up your strengths paragraph. Notice the word strength is at the very beginning of the paragraph and of the sentence. So this tells the reader, get ready. I'm about to share my study's strength. You don't want to bury your strengths at the end of the paragraph. So every study has limitations. You should know what yours are and present them in your discussion. And where possible, it's not always possible, but I suggest being very specific about how you think the limitations impacted your results. So in this example, the authors described that the nationally representative survey they used was self-reported, which is a limitation. So they describe how the fact that it was self-reported could have impacted the results. So in this case, they say it could lead to underestimation of the prevalence of smokeless tobacco use, which was the focus of their study. So while it's not always possible to know what the impact your limitations might have on your results, you should try to understand the potential impact of each limitation, just for your own knowledge, but also to explain how each limitation may have impacted your findings where possible. So this is important because it provides a context for readers to interpret your results, which is the main function of the discussion section. It also adds credibility to your author team because it shows your readers that you're thinking deeply about your analysis and, sort of the validity of your findings. Now I want to present a strategy you can use for some types of limitations to sort of, soften how they land with your readers. I call this the acknowledge and defend strategy. So step 1 is to present or acknowledge your study limitation. So here's an example. The changes across survey years of SLT use definitions may have introduced bias, in particular going from the regular use to ever use screening questions. So this is the limitation. Step 2 is defending your limitation. So where appropriate, provide a reason why the limitation, might not be a big deal or a big problem. In this example, the authors go on to say, nevertheless, as discussed, we used information on the frequency to attempt to increase the current use definition across years, and sensitivity analysis showed that our conclusions are consistent across these alternative definitions. So basically, they're saying that even though the survey questions changed over the years, their sensitivity analysis showed they were coming up with consistent conclusions across years. So again, this approach is not suitable for every limitation, but it can be a good strategy to present certain limitations. My next tip is to make specific suggestions for your future work. So first, I strongly suggest you avoid the cliche, more research is needed or more studies are needed. That is so general that it actually doesn't really have much meaning. Instead, I suggest that you offer a specific suggestion for future studies that will extend and expand your work. So I have an example here, and sorry, it's kind of bulky, but the thing to notice is that the authors are really specific. They say, future studies should focus on characterizing the time-varying effect of smoking on lung cancer by histology, and proving the projections by explicitly incorporating the relationship between smoking patterns and lung cancer rates. And they go on to tell you, how these future studies, why they will be helpful. And this is really the right approach. The more specific you can be in general, I feel like that's 90% of the advice I give to writers in general, in all situations, be more specific. And that's definitely true here. All right, couple of discussion pitfalls. Be sure you don't miss new studies published while you're writing your paper. So you want to show reviewers that you're aware of all the recent work in the area where you're investigating, discuss and cite them in your discussion section. But as you know, things in the tobacco world are typically changing quite rapidly, and new papers are being published every day. So I feel like as writers, we tend to do a lot of literature searching at the beginning of our research process, and it's easy to forget to circle back later in the later stages to consistently do searches over time. So I suggest that you continue searching as you work on your paper to make sure, and even after you send your paper out to review, maybe, you're going back and forth. It could be 6 months, could be 10 months. I'm sure you've experienced that, but, by the time, you respond to the reviewer comments, maybe they have another round. So just keep this in mind. All right. I added this. Normally, I don't talk about titles in this short webinar, but I took out some of the more basic stuff. And I know this is a more advanced audience, but so what purpose does a title serve? First, and most importantly, to get the reader's attention. That's really the most important function of a title. You want to invite readers to keep reading. Also, identify the main topic or message, and it can also be used as an indexing tool. I think I mentioned this in some of my trainings, but I suggest avoiding using overlapping words between your keywords and your title. So you want to cover as much territory as possible between your title and your keywords. They should feel additive rather than repetitive to help readers find your paper. So there's lots of ways to write a title. There's 3 common types of titles. Descriptive. Descriptive titles are also sometimes called informative titles, and they describe a subject or a topic. So the example here is lifelong smokers' experiences with COVID-19, qualitative data from older adults. And the second type is a declarative title. That's the main finding or conclusion of your paper. They're more action-oriented. So my example here is tobacco use is a key risk factor for COVID-19 mortality. So these types of titles tend to be more popular in the medical sort of literature. And finally, question titles. What they are is pretty self-explanatory. The example I came up with here is, does the COVID-19 vaccine in tobacco users prevent long-haul symptoms? So there's no right or wrong choice between these 3. It largely depends on your study, but you can consider these options as you work on coming up with your title. Again, at the risk of harping on this this piece of advice, I suggest avoiding abbreviations unless they're very, very common. This is from a real title that I changed. Again, it was a title from a paper that was on a sexual and reproductive health topic, but I changed it to be a tobacco title. But PMTCT, service utilization and the associated factors among tobacco users with HIV in Eastern Africa. So it could be that the readers of this paper know what PMTCT is. It's prevention of mother-to-child transmission. But, maybe not. Maybe it's a general medicine doc, or, maybe it's a tobacco researcher. So it's something I just see so much of in the literature. And another consideration is for abbreviations is, first, will people understand what it is? But second, are people going to search on that term in a database like PubMed? So, just a few considerations for you. I feel compelled to say this because I was trained as an epidemiologist. Avoid inappropriate causal language. Here we have the word impact, which implies a causal association. So recall that even with a high quality study design, like a randomized controlled trial or a longitudinal study, you still need multiple studies over different settings, along with other criteria to show causation. So I would suggest avoiding causal language unless, you're writing a systematic review of randomized controlled trials or something like that. All right, some more random title tips. Write your final title at the end when you're really clear about what your paper's the message is. Consult your target journal guidelines. As Jana mentioned, sometimes journals have a lot of really specific guidelines. Some are just super loosey-goosey, so it really just depends. Include the setting where relevant. Yeah, that is more of a discussion I have normally in different countries where I, a lot of times people from various locations, like let's say a certain city in Ethiopia or something like that, will add the city or the name of the hospital where the research took place. And I'm always trying to convince people to describe the type of setting rather than the name of the city or the name of the hospital. So instead of saying King Faisal Hospital in Rwanda, to say a large urban, a government hospital in a large urban setting in Rwanda or in a country in Africa or something like that. So that other people in similar settings in South America, people, who are doing research or who work in a large urban setting in a government hospital can say, oh, that actually is applicable to what I'm doing, even though I'm in a totally different, continent. So that's what that bullet is about, maybe less relevant to this audience here. Reduce unnecessary words. Try to make your title as punchy as possible. Really avoid cute, non-informative titles. I was doing a systematic review and reviewing titles of papers, and boy, did I ever see a lot of these. For the love of science, like, what is this article about? Does not tell you anything about the study or the paper, and there's a lot of research on titles and citation counts. Cute titles don't have any citation advantage. So I think I already mentioned this. You want your keywords to supplement, not repeat the words in your title. Having your co-authors or colleagues read your title and give feedback can be really helpful. I've found that people really enjoy reading titles and thinking about titles. It's kind of a fun activity. So It's not super time intensive either. All right. So this is some content I added with a little bit more advanced writing tips, not super advanced, but I know we have a diverse audience, and so I added some new content for you. So the first point I want to discuss is, the need to write to your audience, your target audience. We talked about that at the beginning of the webinar, but it's also true that you want to make your research as accessible as possible to those outside your audience. So the data don't really speak for themselves. You really need to advocate for them and defend your study and data and really describe your study for your audience in the clearest way possible. So the data don't speak for themselves, and yes, scientific papers can be hard to understand. Technical jargon is often required, as a shorthand, or is, specific terms to describe something you're doing that may be very technical. But jargony, dense, and sort of dull writing can make your paper more difficult to understand and recall, both for those in your field, but also for readers outside your field who are interested in cross-disciplinary research, but also for policymakers who, probably don't have a background in the research, especially for this audience. I feel like you're really connected or trying to be connected with policy. Policymakers, might be really interested in your research, but they don't have a lot of technical, vocabulary. So as I mentioned before, a really key skill is writing to your audience, but it's also important to make your research accessible to those outside your audience. So this seems like a tall order. How do you simultaneously write to your target audience and make your paper more accessible to those other audiences outside your core readership? So your target audience is a priority, and your paper should feel relevant and important to them. You can accomplish this by explaining any background your core readers are unlikely to know. We talked about that earlier. Appealing to their values, suggesting applications that pertain to them and that are relevant to them, and suggesting future research that feels relevant to your target audience, like the example of future research on non-pregnant populations versus pregnant populations we looked at earlier. To make your work more accessible to those in other disciplines, policymakers, journalists, and even the public, clarify and simplify your writing. So here I'm talking about minimizing abstractions and jargon, using an active writing style and a narrative format. And that's a lot of things to focus on. So I have some more examples for us to look at and some tips to hopefully make this more concrete. All right. So I'm going to put this advice that I just described in the last slide into two categories. The first one is overcoming what people call the curse of knowledge. And maybe some of you are familiar with this term. This phenomenon is the difficulty that experts have in explaining the details of their research, particularly when they have to explain it to non-expert audiences. And so the idea here is that experts have become so good at what they do, they've kind of lost perspective and can no longer sort of look at their work with fresh eyes and explain it simply to a more naive or less expert audience. They've become, a lot of times experts have become used to using shorthand, like jargon and abstractions, and they sort of forget how to slow down and just really explain things very simply. And then the second piece of advice I have is to tell a story with your research. And a story format, which people sometimes refer to as a narrative format, is known to help readers connect with the material, understand it better, and have better recall of the material. Okay, so one way that writers can overcome this curse of knowledge I just talked about is to make their points more concrete with examples and analogies. And so in this slide, I have an example of an example. Let's take a look. So this is from an article in the New England Journal of Medicine. And this paragraph starts with a fairly abstract point. It says, countervailing effects could diminish the projected benefits of a reduced nicotine policy. Maybe you understand that because you're, sort of in the field, but it's fairly abstract. In the second sentence, though, it provides an example that really helps us understand the point. Let's look at it. For example, also starts with the, like a sort of a clue that we're about to get an example, like, get ready, I'm about to give you an example. So it's a nice sort of flag for the reader, like, get ready, I'm about to share an example. Current smokers could use other combusted tobacco products to maintain their nicotine dependence. So while the authors do use abstract language, they then explain it with this concept with an example. And it's so important, and it can really help your audience connect with what you're saying. The second principle, and this is all research supported, by the way, there are papers that measure these things and have found that these qualities that I'm sharing with you now help people understand the writing more and help people remember more of what they've read when these qualities are in place. All right, so I've talked a lot about technical language. Let's look at an example. This is from an abstract. So avoiding jargon and technical language is kind of like avoiding abbreviations. It is especially important in the title and abstract because it can turn readers away. Whereas if, in the body of the paper, you have a bit more time to explain what the jargon or the abstract concepts are. So this is actually a real example from an article in epidemiology. It's from the abstract. And so this is what the background says. Unsupervised machine learning techniques have become increasingly popular for studying associations between gestational exposure mixtures and human health. So someone familiar with the topic area probably has no problem understanding this text, but someone who's not in the area, like I had trouble making sense of this sentence. So I did a suggested rewrite. It's really a guess because I don't know anything really about this area, but I've rewritten it as unsupervised machine learning, where an algorithm learns patterns without human assistance, is popular for studying gestational exposure to a mixture of chemicals and human health. So a lot of times it does take more words, and in this case, that's also true, to explain something without jargon, and that is a disadvantage, but it can be worth it because you really, truly can reach a broader audience without the technical language. Active writing makes your writing livelier and helps readers connect with what you're saying. There's more to active writing than just the active voice, but I'm going to talk about the active voice in this slide. So in this first example, the authors reference themselves. You can see they say, we examine. And this is a good example of, active voice because the authors are identifying themselves in their story. Let's look at one more example here. This is a made-up example. A nicotine patch was administered. This is passive voice. So in the active voice, I should have said, the person performing the action is made explicit. In the passive voice, you don't always know who performed the action. So this first sentence down in this lower box, a nicotine patch was administered, that's passive voice. In the rewrite, The research assistant applied the nicotine patch to each participant's upper arm. So here, the person who administered the nicotine patch is identified, and we make it more active. So, I'll talk about telling a story in a moment, but these are all, examples of making your writing more active by identifying who is performing the action. And it feels more like a story when we can relate, when you know who the characters are, and we can kind of relate to the story a bit more. All right, so now I'm going to get to the more like narrative research on telling a story with your research. So I don't know if you've ever heard anyone say like, tell a story with your research. It might not be totally obvious how to do that. And so I'm trying to explicate that a bit more in these slides. It turns out that research in the highest impact journals like Science and Nature are written in a more narrative format. I'm actually more likely to use active voice. But they're more likely to be told as a story than be told as sort of like a dry report. And it turns out that more narrative features or papers that are told more as a story are much more highly cited than those that are have fewer narrative features. All right. So researchers have identified specific features of writing that we can use to help us tell a story with our research. And I'm just going to give 3 examples here that are pretty easy to implement. They include setting, narrative perspective, and sensory language. And I'm just going to give one example of each, and then we're going to wrap up. So again, these are specific features that characterize more of a narrative format in someone's scientific article. So the first one is setting. So setting provides a description of where and when your study took place. And these things help create a mental image that distinguish narratives from other types of writing. So it can be in the world's forests or over the past 3 decades. It can be something as simple as that. But let's look at this example. This is example of a title. It's a very simple example. You can see the setting here: comparison of smoking history patterns among African American and white cohorts in the United States, born 1890 to 1990. So here we have elements of time and place. You have the setting. All right, one more quick example. This is from a paper in Scientific Reports. Qualitative data on U.S. adolescents suggests that e-cigarette use in schools may be common because e-cigarette aerosol dissipates quickly and the device is easy to conceal. There was even a U.S. media report of adolescents using e-cigarettes in classrooms. So no geographic references made here, but you have this setting of a school and a classroom, which really brings this narrative to life. You can kind of imagine the story taking place in this setting. All right, the second one is narrative perspective. So the idea here is that you're using this is jargon, I guess. You're using a first-person narrative. So in other words, you're referring to your author team, the researchers. You're referring to we, our. And so in this example, the authors are saying we analyzed lung cancer incidence rates. First-person narratives have a stronger sort of presence than other narrative, perspectives like third person or passive voice. When you refer to yourself in a paper, you become a character in the story, and that's more compelling for readers. All right, final example. Sensory language. So sensory language includes references to sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and feelings. And sensory language appeals to your readers' senses of emotions. They help your readers engage with your story. Basically, you're adding interest and sometimes even drama by adding in sensory language. I have two quick examples. In the first, I'm not going to read the entire quote, but the authors express a growing concern about e-cigarette use in youth. And this helps the reader to understand the importance of the problem. It evokes empathy and it highlights, sort of the importance of the topic. In the second sentence or example, it refers to a deadly pattern, and it's the same idea. Empathetic language that sounds an alarm about the levity of the situation. It helps draw your readers in, and it invites them to care deeply about the topic. All right, so that was a lot. I've got some time for questions here and discussion, but this is a summary. We talked about strategically choosing a target journal, writing to your readers, following went through all the different sections of the paper with some tips, citing appropriately, talked about your research objectives. They should be specific and testable. Talked about using the magic word because in your methods to justify and provide detail on your methods. Describing your results in concrete words using directionality, title tables, figure legend, the acknowledge and defend strategy we talked about being specific about future steps, and then overcoming the curse of knowledge and telling a story for greater impact and broader reach. I do have some additional resources. I won't go through these now, but these will be in the handouts for you. I want to acknowledge the Castor leadership, David Levy and Raphael, and then the CEC, Molly, David, Ritesh, and Nargis, and also thank Amanda, the manager of the center. Thank you so much for being great collaborators and for inviting me to participate.